I'm Meg Wilcox. I'm a member of the journalism faculty here at MRU and a member of the MRFA. And joining me is Marc Schroeder. He's the Advocacy Officer and a member of the executive with the MRFA. And today, Marc, we are talking about expenses and surplus.
That's right. We'll start with surpluses. This is something that faculty, I think quite rightly, tend to focus on when they look at MRU financial trends and our budget and so on. As I'm sure everyone knows, our annual surplus is our operating revenue minus our operating expenses. And if you look at surplus trends over the last 5 years, if you, for example, keep a running 5-year average, over the last 5 years, at least for the available published annual reports that we have, and the 2020-2021 annual report has not been publicly released on the university's website yet, but the running 5-year average for our surpluses is about $750,000, which is nothing to sneeze at. But to put it in context, that also represents 0.3% of our operating revenue. So it's very important to keep an eye on surplus, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Having said that, it will be very interesting to see the 2020-2021 numbers when that MRU annual report for the most recent financial year is posted, because we do expect to see a larger reported surplus than maybe even we've come to expect over recent years. So we'll keep our eyes open for that.
So what exactly are we looking at here?
So here we're looking at our operating revenues mapped against our operating expenses since 2008, so well over a decade. And when we cut to the next slide, you'll see that the next slide starts at 2012. But I want to give sort of a longer term historical picture just to put those numbers and the next slide in context. These numbers, by the way, are in thousands of dollars, and they have been adjusted for inflation. So these are in constant 2009 dollars, just so that we can compare year to year in a more intelligible way. So leading up to 2010, we did see large growth in the university's budget. And that ended in 2010 with the grant freeze that we talked about last time. And since then, really revenues and expenses have hovered around the $200 million a year range in constant dollars, sometimes a little up, sometimes a little down. Of course, we did see the big cut to our operating grant in 2013, which led to a trough. Of course, we did see in 2015 the university pivot to that strategy we discussed last time of trying to increase enrollment growth, prioritize enrollment growth while limiting growth in the instructional expenses. Mm-hmm. So that strategy began there. And so at the same time, I'm sure most of our listeners will remember we had a change in government. And that government didn't necessarily undo any of the former damage, but they did give us annual inflationary increases to our operating grant. So we didn't tend to fall behind due to inflation. But we essentially didn't gain much ground either. I did want to point here to what recent trends under the most recent government from 2019 onwards. We've had 3 rounds of cuts to our operating grant, with more rounds of cuts expected. That's on top of pandemic effects. Only one of those 3 most recent provincial cuts are shown here. So it's going to drop off much more sharply, our operating grant, when we extend the chart. But essentially, that is something we want our members to watch out for. But this will put in context what we see in the next slide. The expenses shown here are the orange line, but there are some more deeper stories hiding in that overall institutional operating expense line. So I want to try to break that down a little bit.
Sounds good.
So MRU's expenses are, if you look at the annual report, our expenses are categorized by function. They're also categorized separately by object. This slide shows a high-level breakdown of expenses by function. The one that I want to draw people's attention to is the instruction function. So the instruction function is essentially spending within faculties. A lot of it corresponds to academic staff salaries, but it's not only that, salaries and benefits, but not only that. It's funding within faculties generally that supports our core academic mission. So teaching and something called non-sponsored research. I want to contrast that with sponsored research. People may be alarmed by the growth there, but that's actually a good news story. When we spend more on sponsored research, it's because there's a corresponding growth in revenues because faculty are getting NSERC grants, SHRC grants, they're getting external sources of funding. And so we would expect to see growth in spending on the expense side. So that's not a bad thing. Non-sponsored research is essentially spending to support the research function that is done institutionally, for example, by paying people's salaries and providing other kinds of just routine institutional supports. So that's been essentially declining since 2012. And I think the story there is that at first, of course, when we received a large cut to our operating grant in 2013, the university responded by trying to shrink somewhat, by trying to throttle back enrollments, by trying to throttle back faculty hiring. And so we do see that decline there, I think, for that reason. And we see the university reducing spending in other areas as well, such as higher level institutional supports, facility operations and maintenance, and so on. Although we did still see growth in academic and student support, which is spending on indirect supports for students and the academic function, not direct instruction, say. But as of 2015, when the university decided on a new strategic direction, we saw the continued effort to keep a lid on supporting the instruction function with growth in areas that were viewed as strategic to the university. And even though that has leveled off somewhat in the intervening years, we're still seeing a continued downward pressure on the instruction function.
So as a member, what is the most important thing to take away from this slide?
I think what this means is that the university is subject to external pressures, such as political decisions around our operating grant. And so we definitely have to keep our eye on two things. For one side of the coin, we have to keep an eye on what's happening in the broader political context. And that's a bigger political question beyond just Mount Royal itself. But we also have to keep a really close eye on how the institution sets its priorities internally. We have to make sure that with the monies that we do have, that the institution continues to prioritize its core credit, instruction, and research function.